Everyone thinks our marriage is built on love, loyalty, and stability, and maybe part of it is. But over time, I learned something more important: understanding value. While he believed affection was enough, I paid attention to contracts, assets, and the quiet guarantees people overlook when they feel safe. I didn't rush. I didn't demand. I simply positioned myself wisely. Love may have brought us together, but foresight is what will carry me forward. In the end, I didn't take anything that wasn't already secured. I just understood the ending long before he did. If this story helps you examine your own motivations honestly, or makes you question the difference between security and exploitation, please leave a like and subscribe. There's a particular kind of honesty that comes when you stop pretending your motivations are purer than they actually are. When you acknowledge the transactional elements of relationships that polite society prefers to ignore. When you admit that security and stability can matter as much or more than romantic love in sustaining a marriage. My name is Victoria Ashford, and I'm 43 years old. For 18 years, I've been married to a man named Richard Ashford who loves me deeply, consistently, without reservation or condition. And I've spent those same 18 years building financial security through our marriage, while maintaining the appearance of mutual affection, preparing for the comfortable future his death will eventually provide me, all while telling myself this was simply practical planning rather than something darker and more calculating. This is the story of how I came to see my own marriage clearly, to recognize the mercenary calculations I'd been making while pretending they were reasonable financial prudence, and how discovering that Richard knew exactly what I was and loved me anyway forced me to confront whether I was capable of something more than strategic self-interest. It's not a comfortable story to tell, requires admitting things about myself that make me appear cold and manipulative, but perhaps there's value in honesty about the calculations many people make, but few acknowledge openly. I met Richard when I was 25 and he was 42, a 17-year age gap that raised eyebrows among both our families and friends. I was working as an executive assistant at a financial services firm where my mother had helped me get the position through a connection she'd cultivated over years of working as a receptionist at a law office. The job paid decently, enough to cover my small apartment in a marginal neighborhood, my student loan payments from the state university I'd attended, and basic living expenses with little left over. I was making around $45,000 a year, which felt like success compared to my childhood, but also made me acutely aware of the ceiling above me, the limitations of my earning potential without graduate degrees or family connections I didn't have. My background was solidly working class. My father had worked in construction until a workplace injury disabled him when I was 15, after which my mother supported our family on reception and administrative work that barely covered bills. We'd never been destitute, never homeless or hungry, but money was always tight, always a source of stress and argument, always the underlying anxiety that colored every decision. I'd watched my parents' marriage strain under financial pressure, seen how my mother's resentment grew as she became sole breadwinner for a family that included not just me but my 2 younger brothers, witnessed how lack of money eroded affection and partnership until my parents were essentially antagonistic roommates sharing space and childcare responsibilities. That childhood had taught me to value financial security above almost everything else, to see money not as luxury, but as necessity for basic peace and stability, to understand that romantic love was fragile, but economic security was concrete. I'd sworn to myself from young age that I would never be financially dependent on anyone the way my mother had been dependent on my father's income until his injury, and then never be trapped in resentment the way she'd been trapped supporting a family on inadequate wages. I would build my own security, or I would partner with someone whose security was substantial enough to share. Richard was a client of the financial services firm where I worked, though I didn't meet him through direct work interaction initially. We met at a holiday party the firm threw for clients and employees, one of those awkward corporate social events where people mingle with champagne and forced conversation. I was there because attendance was expected of all employees, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the event and couldn't really afford, trying to network and make connections that might advance my career even incrementally. Richard approached me at the bar where I was waiting for a drink, introduced himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to social situations, asked what I did at the firm. We started talking, and I was immediately struck by how different he was from the men I typically dated. Older, obviously, but also more polished, more sophisticated, more comfortable in his own skin. He was intelligent and well-read, could discuss current events and literature with equal facility, had traveled extensively, and spoke casually about places I'd only seen in photographs. He was also kind and genuinely interested in what I said, asking questions about my life and opinions in ways that felt like actual curiosity rather than perfunctory politeness. We talked for over an hour at that party, standing by the windows overlooking the city, the conversation flowing easily in ways that surprised me given our age difference and different backgrounds. When the party was winding down, Richard asked if he could take me to dinner sometime, said he'd enjoyed our conversation and would like to continue it in a setting where we could actually hear each other without competing with party noise. I agreed, gave him my phone number, walked away from that interaction feeling something I couldn't quite identify, attraction certainly, but also awareness of opportunity, consciousness that this man represented access to a world I'd never been part of but had always observed from outside. Our first date was at a restaurant I'd never been to. The kind of place where meals cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week, where the wine list was leather-bound and extensive, where the service was attentive without being intrusive. Richard was generous and thoughtful, asking about my preferences, making recommendations based on what I indicated I liked, ordering things I'd never tried, and encouraging me to experience new flavors and preparations. The conversation ranged widely. We talked about books we'd read, movies we'd seen, our families and backgrounds, our careers and aspirations. I was honest with Richard about my working-class background, about my family's financial struggles, about my own modest position and limited prospects for significant advancement without further education I couldn't afford. I didn't hide that I came from a completely different economic world than he inhabited, that my frame of reference for money and security was shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. Richard didn't seem bothered by these differences. If anything, seemed to appreciate my honesty, said he valued people who were direct about their situations and aspirations, rather than pretending to be something they weren't. Richard was equally open about his own background and current situation. He'd grown up middle class, attended good public universities on scholarships and loans, worked in commercial real estate development for 20 years, building a successful business and substantial personal fortune. He'd been married before, in his 20s, a relationship that had produced 2 sons who were now adults living independently. The marriage had ended in divorce about 10 years before I met him, amicable enough that he and his ex-wife maintained cordial relationship for their children's sake, but finished emotionally long before it ended legally. He was honest about his financial success, didn't hide his wealth but also didn't flaunt it ostentatiously. He lived in a beautiful home in an exclusive neighborhood, drove a luxury car, belonged to a prestigious country club, moved through the world with the ease that comes from never worrying about money. But he presented these things as facts about his life rather than as status symbols meant to impress, seemed more interested in discussing ideas and experiences than in displaying wealth. That combination, substantial money, without apparent arrogance about having it, was attractive to me in ways I recognized but didn't fully examine at the time. We dated for 10 months before Richard proposed, a whirlwind by some standards, but not unusual for a man in his 40s who knew what he wanted and saw no reason to delay once he'd found it. During those months, I was simultaneously genuine in my affection for Richard and calculating in my assessment of what relationship with him could provide. I enjoyed his company, appreciated his intelligence and kindness, valued the experiences and opportunities being with him opened up for me. But I was also very conscious of the material benefits, the lifestyle I was accessing through our relationship, the financial security that marriage to him would represent. I told myself this dual awareness was mature and realistic, that considering practical factors alongside emotional connection was simply being honest about what relationships involved. Everyone thinks about compatibility on multiple levels when choosing partners: emotional, intellectual, physical, and yes, financial. I was just being more conscious and deliberate about the financial calculations than most people admitted to themselves or others. That rationalization allowed me to ignore the more uncomfortable truth, that I was weighing Richard's wealth almost as heavily as his character. that I was making strategic decisions about our relationship based significantly on economic benefit. When Richard proposed, presenting me with a 3-carat diamond ring that cost more than I'd earned in a year at my job, I said yes immediately. I loved him, or believed I did, in the ways I understood love at that point in my life. But I also understood very clearly that I was saying yes to financial security, to access to wealth and lifestyle I could never achieve on my own, to a future that would be comfortable and stable in ways my childhood never was. The engagement ring on my finger was beautiful, but it was also a contract, a promise of economic benefits that were as important to me as the romantic promises we were making. The wedding planning process revealed class differences between my family and Richard's world in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable. Richard wanted an elegant wedding at an exclusive venue, was generous about budget, and willing to pay for whatever would make the day special. My mother was overwhelmed by the scale and expense, made comments about how the money being spent on one day could have paid for my brother's college tuition or covered years of the mortgage on their modest house. She wasn't being critical exactly, more just struggling to process the casual attitude toward expenses that would have been catastrophic to our family budget, but were trivial to Richard. I found myself caught between two worlds during wedding planning, trying to honor my family's values and background, while also embracing the lifestyle I was entering through marriage to Richard, trying to be grateful for his generosity while also feeling some shame about how eagerly I was accepting it, trying to maintain connection to my working-class roots, while also consciously leaving them behind for the upper-middle-class life I was entering. The internal conflict was uncomfortable, made worse by my mother's occasional pointed comments about hoping I loved Richard for himself and not just for his money, implying she saw the calculations I was making even if I was trying to hide them from myself. The wedding itself was beautiful, held at a country club, attended by Richard's extensive network of business associates and friends from his social circle. My own smaller contingent of family and friends, somewhat overwhelmed by the elegance and expense. I wore a designer gown that cost more than my first car, walked down an aisle decorated with thousands of dollars worth of flowers, celebrated with champagne and elaborate catering, and a band that played into the early morning hours. It was a fairy tale wedding in many ways, the kind of event I'd only seen in movies, made possible by Richard's wealth and willingness to spend on making our special day memorable. But even as I enjoyed the wedding and appreciated Richard's generosity, I was conscious of what the event represented beyond just romantic celebration. This was my entry into a different economic class, my formal acceptance into Richard's world of wealth and privilege, the beginning of a life funded entirely by money I hadn't earned. The wedding marked not just the beginning of our marriage, but the beginning of my transformation from working woman, supporting herself to wealthy man's wife supported by his income and assets. That transformation was something I wanted, something I'd chosen deliberately, but also something that carried implications I didn't fully understand yet. The early years of our marriage established patterns that would characterize our relationship for nearly 2 decades. Richard was generous and affectionate, clearly loved me deeply, seemed to take genuine pleasure in providing for me and making me happy. About a year into our marriage, he suggested I stop working, said his income was more than sufficient to support us both comfortably, that there was no need for me to continue in a job I'd never found particularly fulfilling. He presented it as gift, as freeing me from the necessity of work so I could pursue interests and activities that brought me more satisfaction than administrative tasks. I agreed to stop working with minimal hesitation, rationalizing the decision in various ways. I told myself I would use the time to pursue education and develop new skills, that I would do meaningful volunteer work and contribute to our community, that being free from work obligations would allow me to better support Richard's career and manage our household. These rationalizations had some truth to them. I did volunteer, did take some classes, did manage our home and social obligations effectively, but the underlying reality was that I was choosing financial dependency, choosing to be supported entirely by Richard's income, choosing a role that made me economically vulnerable in ways my younger self had sworn to avoid. The rationalization I used most frequently was that marriage was partnership, that my contributions to Richard's life and career had value even if they didn't generate direct income, that wives had traditionally been supported by husbands, and this was just a continuation of that long-standing arrangement. I managed our household, planned and hosted social events that were important for Richard's business relationships, traveled with him when he needed companion at conferences or industry gatherings, provided emotional support and partnership that allowed him to focus on his demanding career. These contributions were real and valuable, I told myself, even if they didn't result in paychecks with my name on them. But I was also planning for the future in ways I never discussed with Richard, in ways that revealed my more mercenary calculations beneath the surface justifications. I paid careful attention to our financial arrangements, made sure I understood the structure of Richard's assets and business interests, ensured I was named appropriately on accounts and properties. I wasn't just accepting Richard's generosity. I was strategically positioning myself to benefit from it long term, thinking ahead to inheritance and widowhood, even in those early years of marriage when such planning might seem morbid or premature. When Richard suggested we update his estate planning about 3 years into our marriage, I was very interested in the details in ways that went beyond simple curiosity or appropriate spousal involvement. I asked careful questions about trusts and inheritance structures, about what provisions were being made for me versus his adult sons from his first marriage, about how assets would be transferred, and what control I would have over wealth after his death. I hired my own attorney to review the estate documents Richard's lawyer prepared, wanting to ensure my interests were protected, making certain that the generosity Richard showed during his life would extend to substantial inheritance after his death. Richard never questioned my interest in estate planning, seemed to interpret it as responsible partnership, as appropriate concern for our shared financial future. He was remarkably open about his finances in ways many spouses aren't, shared detailed information about his net worth and asset allocation, discussed his business investments and real estate holdings, explained his plans for wealth transfer across generations. This transparency was something I appreciated and took full advantage of, using the information to understand exactly what I stood to inherit, exactly how secure my financial future would be as Richard's widow. The estate plan Richard established was generous beyond what I'd privately hoped for, though I was careful not to show too much satisfaction when his attorney explained the details. I would inherit our primary residence outright, a beautiful home worth several $1,000,000 in an exclusive neighborhood. I would receive liquid assets immediately upon his death: stocks, bonds, cash accounts totaling approximately $3 million that would be mine to use as I saw fit. And I would be primary beneficiary of several trusts that would provide ongoing income for the rest of my life. Trusts funded with commercial real estate holdings and investment portfolios that generated hundreds of thousands in annual income. The total value of what I would inherit was conservatively estimated at $15 million, though the actual value would depend on market conditions and business performance at the time of Richard's death. That number, $15 million, became a kind of talisman in my mind, a guarantee of security and comfort, far beyond anything I could have achieved through my own earning potential. Confirmation that my decision to marry Richard and accept financial dependency had been strategically sound. Every year we stayed married was another year of potential asset appreciation, another year of wealth accumulation that would eventually benefit me when Richard died, and I became a very comfortable widow. These calculations weren't things I was proud of, weren't thoughts I would ever admit to anyone, including close friends or family, but they were present in how I thought about our marriage, how I evaluated whether to stay or leave during difficult periods, how I made decisions about our relationship. The knowledge that Richard's death would make me wealthy influenced my behavior in subtle ways. I was attentive to his health in ways that were ostensibly caring but also strategic. I avoided conflicts that might make him reconsider our estate arrangements. I maintained harmony and affection even when I was frustrated or bored, because the cost of divorce or estrangement had to be weighed against the value of eventual inheritance. I never consciously wished for Richard's death, never wanted him to die or took any action to harm him, but I was aware, in ways I tried not to examine too closely, that his death would benefit me enormously, that the 17-year age gap meant I would likely outlive him by decades and enjoy his wealth long after he was gone, that every year of our marriage was building toward a future of financial independence and security funded by his life's work. These thoughts made me uncomfortable when I acknowledged them directly, so mostly I kept them in the background of my consciousness, present but not examined, influencing my behavior while I pretended other motivations. As our marriage progressed through its first decade, patterns became increasingly clear that revealed the transactional nature of what I was doing even as I maintained the performance of loving, devoted wife. I was attentive to Richard's health in ways that went beyond normal spousal concern. I encouraged him to see doctors regularly for checkups and screenings, monitored his medications, and made sure he took them consistently, pushed him to maintain healthy diet and exercise habits, ostensibly because I cared about his well-being, but also because maintaining his health maintained my future financial security. A Richard who lived to 80 rather than 70 meant 10 more years of asset accumulation, 10 more years of building the inheritance that would eventually be mine. I was also very careful never to antagonize Richard in ways that might make him reconsider our estate arrangements or our marriage more broadly. I maintained affection and harmony even during periods when I found our relationship boring or frustrating, calculated the cost of honest expression against the value of inheritance, chose pleasant accommodation over authentic conflict. When Richard made decisions I disagreed with, about travel plans or social obligations or household choices, I rarely pushed back forcefully, didn't assert my preferences when doing so might create significant friction between us. The performance of agreeable, supportive wife was strategic, designed to maintain Richard's affection and ensure the estate planning that benefited me remained in place. I also began preparing for eventual widowhood in subtle ways that were ostensibly about healthy independence, but were really about readiness for the life I anticipated after Richard's death. I maintained my own social connections, separate from Richard's circle, cultivated friendships and networks that would sustain me after his death, when his business associates and country club friends might drift away. I developed interests and activities that were mine alone rather than couple-focused, building a life structure that wouldn't collapse when Richard was no longer present to be its center. I even took some classes in financial management and investment strategy, ostensibly to better understand Richard's business and be able to discuss his work intelligently, but really to prepare for managing the substantial assets I would inherit as his widow. I studied estate planning and trust administration, learned about tax implications of inheritance, educated myself on wealth preservation strategies, all framed as supportive wife trying to be helpful partner, but actually as future wealthy widow preparing to handle millions of dollars without Richard there to manage it for me. These preparations were rational steps that any spouse might reasonably take, maintaining independent social connections, developing separate interests, learning about family finances. But my motivations weren't just healthy independence or responsible partnership. I was preparing for Richard's death, planning for the wealthy single life I anticipated after our marriage ended through his passing, thinking strategically about a future I never discussed with him, but that shaped many of my choices and priorities. The calculation involved in these preparations was something I tried not to examine too directly, something I rationalized as prudent planning rather than the cold opportunism it actually represented. Around our 10th anniversary, when I was 35 and Richard was 52, I started noticing his health declining in small but accumulating ways. Nothing dramatic or life-threatening, just the normal aging that happens to everyone, but that seemed more significant given the age gap between us. Richard developed high blood pressure that required daily medication, started having minor arthritis in his hands and knees that made physical activities less enjoyable, gained some weight despite efforts to maintain fitness, showed the general wear that comes with aging bodies even for people who take reasonably good care of themselves. Each health issue made me more conscious of Richard's mortality, more aware that the age gap that had seemed romantic and insignificant when we married now meant I was married to someone who was genuinely aging while I was still in my 30s with decades of life potentially ahead after his death. I found myself doing mental calculations. If Richard lived to 75, I'd be 58 when widowed, still young enough to potentially remarry, or at least enjoy several decades as wealthy single woman. If he lived to 80, I'd be 63, still healthy and active, still able to travel and enjoy the wealth I'd inherit. Even if he lived to 85, which seemed optimistic given his health trends, I'd be 68 with potentially 15 or 20 years to enjoy being wealthy widow. These calculations were morbid and mercenary, things I would never admit to anyone, things that made me uncomfortable when I acknowledged them too directly. But they were present in how I processed Richard's health issues, how I thought about our future together, how I evaluated the trade-offs of staying in a marriage that was comfortable but not particularly passionate or fulfilling emotionally. The knowledge that waiting would eventually be rewarded with substantial inheritance influenced my willingness to stay through periods of dissatisfaction or boredom, my calculation that enduring whatever frustrations existed in our marriage was worth the eventual financial payoff. I also noticed myself sometimes feeling impatient about timeline, catching myself thinking thoughts like, if something happened to Richard now, I'd still be young enough to really enjoy the inheritance. Or, the longer he lives, the less time I'll have to enjoy being wealthy. These thoughts horrified me when I acknowledged them consciously, seemed to reveal something dark and selfish about my character that I didn't want to accept. I never acted on these thoughts, never did anything to harm Richard or hasten his death, never allowed the calculations to translate into actual malicious behavior. But having the thoughts at all, allowing myself to mentally calculate optimal timing for my husband's death, was deeply disturbing evidence of how mercenary I'd become. The cognitive dissonance between the loving wife I appeared to be and the calculating opportunist I actually was became increasingly difficult to maintain as our marriage moved into its second decade. In public and even in private much of the time, I played my role well: attentive partner, gracious hostess, supportive spouse who facilitated Richard's career and social obligations. I attended charity galas and business dinners, made conversation with his colleagues and clients, represented our household in community and social contexts with appropriate polish and charm. I was good at the performance, had become skilled over years at projecting warmth and devotion I didn't fully feel, at maintaining the facade of loving marriage while privately calculating about inheritance and widowhood. But the performance was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated when I'd entered this arrangement, constantly monitoring my behavior to ensure I appeared appropriately affectionate, constantly calculating whether honest expression would jeopardize my financial position, constantly maintaining strategic positioning while pretending spontaneous love. It created a psychological burden that accumulated over years. I sometimes caught myself wondering who I actually was beneath the performance, whether the calculating strategist was my true self, or whether years of pretending to be devoted wife had created some authentic affection that coexisted with the mercenary motivations. Richard seemed increasingly aware that something was off in our marriage as we moved into our second decade together, though he didn't directly confront me about it for several years. He would sometimes make comments that suggested he noticed my emotional distance, my strategic accommodation of his preferences, my performance of affection rather than spontaneous expression of genuine feeling. He'd say things like, "You don't have to agree with everything I suggest, you know," or, "It's okay to tell me when you're actually angry rather than being diplomatic about it," or, "I'd rather you be honest about your preferences than constantly deferring to mine." These comments made me uncomfortable because they suggested Richard saw through my performance more than I'd realized, that the strategic accommodation I thought was maintaining his affection and our marriage was actually creating distance he could perceive. But I didn't know how to respond to these invitations to greater authenticity without revealing the calculations underlying my behavior, without admitting that much of my accommodation was strategic rather than genuine. So I would deflect, insist that I was being honest, and that I simply didn't have strong preferences about many things, maintain the performance while he indicated he saw through it. The tension between performance and authenticity in our marriage came to a head about 3 years ago, when I was 40 and Richard was 57. He'd gone to his cardiologist for a routine checkup and come home with concerning news: significant blockage in one of his coronary arteries, requiring immediate surgery to place a stent. The procedure was relatively routine, his doctors assured us, very common for men his age with his health history, low risk of complications. The stent would improve blood flow to his heart, reduce risk of heart attack, likely extend his life by preventing more serious cardiac events. But there was risk, however small: anesthesia complications, surgical errors, unforeseen medical events. Any number of things could potentially go wrong during even routine procedures. Suddenly, I was confronted with the real possibility that Richard might die much sooner than I'd been vaguely imagining in my long-term calculations about eventual widowhood. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, giving me days to process this possibility, days during which I discovered things about myself I'd been avoiding acknowledging for years. My reaction to Richard's health crisis was complex and deeply revealing. I was concerned, genuinely worried about the surgery and wanting it to go well. The thought of Richard dying on the operating table produced real anxiety and distress that suggested I had more authentic feeling for him than I sometimes believed. But alongside that genuine concern was another stream of thought that horrified me when I acknowledged it consciously. Calculations about what his death would mean financially, assessment of how the inheritance process would work if he died suddenly, even thoughts about how my life might look as a 40-year-old wealthy widow. I found myself doing mental arithmetic about the estate despite my horror at having such thoughts. The house was worth approximately $4 million. The liquid assets were now closer to $4 million given market appreciation. The trust values had grown to approximately $8 million based on the real estate holdings and investment performance. If Richard died during surgery, I would inherit approximately $16 million at age 40, becoming a very wealthy woman with decades ahead to enjoy the money. The thought should have made me feel guilty and ashamed, and it did, but it was also present, undeniable, revealing the depth of my mercenary calculations. I also found myself thinking strategically about the logistics of Richard's potential death. Would I stay in our current house or sell it and buy something smaller? Would I remain in our city or relocate somewhere new and start fresh? Would I maintain connections with Richard's social circle? Or let those relationships fade naturally without him as the link? How would I manage the inheritance and structure my finances for maximum security and income? These practical considerations were reasonable things to think about when facing the possibility of widowhood, but the level of detail I was considering, the lack of grief in my calculations about life after Richard's death, revealed how emotionally disconnected I'd become from our marriage. The days before Richard's surgery were surreal. I played the role of concerned, devoted wife, accompanying him to pre-surgical appointments, helping him prepare, expressing appropriate worry and affection. But internally, I was struggling with the recognition of how calculating I'd become, how much of my concern was about my financial future rather than about Richard as a person I supposedly loved. I kept trying to summon deeper emotion, more genuine devastation at the thought of losing him. But what I felt was mostly anxiety about the uncertainty and strategic assessment of implications rather than pure grief. Richard himself seemed calm about the surgery, confident in his doctors and the routine nature of the procedure, not particularly worried about the small risks involved. The night before the surgery, we had dinner together at home, just the two of us since his adult sons lived in other cities and weren't coming for what was supposed to be straightforward outpatient procedure. Richard talked about the future, places he wanted to travel that we hadn't been yet, projects he was working on in his business that would take years to complete, plans for our 20th anniversary that was still 2 years away. He was clearly thinking about a future he expected to have, planning beyond the surgery without apparent concern it might not go well. I listened and nodded and made appropriate responses, but internally I was thinking about how much he was assuming about our future together, how much he seemed to take for granted my presence and partnership for decades to come, how different his confident planning was from my own awareness that his death might happen any time and leave me wealthy but alone. The gap between his assumptions and my calculations felt immense, made me feel guilty and dishonest, but I didn't know how to bridge it without admitting things about myself and our marriage that would devastate him. The surgery itself went well. Richard was in the operating room for about 2 hours, emerged with a successfully placed stent and good initial prognosis. His cardiologist said everything had gone perfectly. The blockage was cleared. Blood flow was restored. Richard should recover quickly and be back to normal activities within a few weeks. I expressed relief and gratitude, hugged Richard when they let me see him in recovery, played the role of grateful wife whose husband had survived potential crisis. But alongside the genuine relief I felt was something else. A strange disappointment that surprised and disturbed me, a sense that I'd been preparing emotionally for widowhood and now had to readjust to continuation of our marriage. That reaction, disappointment that Richard had survived, was so shocking to me that I couldn't initially acknowledge it consciously, but it was present, undeniable when I forced myself to examine my feelings honestly. Some part of me had been preparing for his death, had been anticipating the inheritance and the independence and the wealthy widow lifestyle, had been ready for this particular ending to our marriage, having to readjust to his survival, to continuation of our relationship and postponement of the inheritance I'd been calculating about, required recalibrating expectations in ways that revealed how much I'd been emotionally preparing for and even anticipating his death. In the weeks after Richard's surgery, while he recovered at home and I cared for him, I found myself doing deeper self-examination than I'd done in years, confronting uncomfortable truths about myself and our marriage that I'd been avoiding. What did I actually feel for Richard beyond appreciation for the comfortable life he provided? Did I love him at all? Or did I just value what he gave me access to? Would I stay married to him if he lost his wealth tomorrow? If we had to live on my earning potential rather than his accumulated assets? If I was honest, really brutally honest, would I care if he died beyond grief about losing my meal ticket? The answers to these questions were deeply uncomfortable, revealed a coldness and selfishness in myself that I didn't want to acknowledge. I wasn't sure I loved Richard in any meaningful sense beyond enjoying his company and appreciating his generosity. I was almost certain I wouldn't stay married to him if he suddenly lost his wealth, and we had to live modestly on whatever I could earn returning to workforce after years away. And while I didn't actively want him to die, I also wasn't sure I would feel genuine grief beyond anxiety about my own future and loss of the comfortable life I'd grown accustomed to. These realizations painted a picture of myself as fundamentally mercenary and self-interested, someone who'd spent 18 years performing love while actually calculating about inheritance. I also started noticing Richard's behavior toward me with new attention, paying closer observation to how he treated me, what he said, how he seemed to view our marriage. And what I saw was a man who genuinely loved me, who valued our partnership beyond just having an attractive wife on his arm, who seemed to take real pleasure in my company and happiness, who treated me with consistent kindness and consideration, even when I didn't particularly deserve it. Richard was attentive to my preferences, remembered things I mentioned caring about, made efforts to please me and make our life together enjoyable. His affection seemed authentic and deep, based on genuine appreciation for who I was rather than what I provided him. The asymmetry between Richard's feelings and mine, between his genuine affection and my calculating self-interest, became harder to ignore after his surgery. He loved me deeply and authentically. I valued what he provided and appreciated his company, but wasn't sure I felt anything approaching his depth of feeling. He was planning a future with me that extended decades. I was preparing for his death and my life after it. He treated me as beloved partner. I treated him as generous but temporary provider whose death would be financially beneficial transition point. The inequality in our emotional investments was stark when I allowed myself to see it clearly. I started wondering whether Richard was aware of this asymmetry, whether he knew or suspected that I'd married him partly for money and security, that my affections were mixed with calculations about inheritance, that I was preparing for widowhood while he was planning for decades more of marriage. The thought that he might know, might have understood all along what I was, made me feel exposed and vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. If he knew, why had he married me? Why did he stay? Why did he continue treating me with such consistent affection and generosity if he understood I was essentially using him for financial security? These questions tormented me in the months after Richard's surgery, made me more conscious of his behavior and comments, more attuned to any indication he might see through my performance to the calculations beneath. And gradually I started noticing small things that suggested Richard was more aware than I'd realized. Comments he'd make about financial planning that seemed designed to reassure me about my future security, ways he'd emphasize that I'd be taken care of regardless of what happened to him, reassurances about the estate planning and trust structures that seemed focused on easing my worries about future rather than just addressing practical matters. He also started occasionally making comments about our age gap and his mortality that suggested he thought about these things more than I'd realized. He'd say things like, "when I'm gone," rather than, "if something happens to me," indicating acceptance of his eventual death as certainty rather than distant possibility. He'd mention that he wanted me to be happy after his death, that he hoped I'd remarry eventually rather than being alone, that he'd structured things financially so I'd have complete independence and security to build whatever life I wanted. These comments suggested Richard thought about our future not as indefinitely extended marriage, but as partnership that would end with his death and my continuation into widowhood. About 6 months after Richard's surgery, we were sitting together one evening in our living room, both reading, the kind of quiet, companionable moment that characterized much of our marriage. Richard put down his book and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, serious but not angry, thoughtful but not distant. "Victoria," he said, using my full name rather than the Vic he usually called me. "We should talk about something I've been thinking about for a while. Something important about our marriage." My heart started pounding, anxiety flooding through me. This was it. He was going to confront me about my calculations, about the mercenary nature of our marriage from my side, about how I'd married him for money and been preparing for his death. I set down my own book, tried to compose my face into something neutral, waited for the confrontation I'd been unconsciously dreading for years. "Okay," I said carefully, not sure what else to say or how to prepare for whatever was coming. Richard took a breath, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that I'm aware you married me partly for my money and security. I've always known. I'm not stupid or naive, Victoria. Men my age don't usually attract beautiful women in their 20s without wealth being a significant factor in that attraction. I made my peace with that reality a long time ago, before we even got married. I decided that what we had together was valuable, even if your motivations for being with me were mixed, even if financial security was a major part of why you chose me." I felt like I'd been punched, all my careful pretenses stripped away by his casual acknowledgement of what I thought I'd been hiding successfully for 18 years. I didn't marry you only for money," I stammered, not sure whether to deny or confess, trying desperately to figure out what he wanted to hear, what response would preserve our marriage and my financial security. "I didn't say only," Richard responded calmly, his tone not accusatory but matter of fact, as if we were discussing neutral topic rather than the foundation of our marriage. "I said partly, and I'm not accusing you of anything or upset about it. I'm just saying I've always understood the practical elements of why you chose to be with me, and I was fine with that arrangement because what I got in return, your company, your partnership, the life we've built together, has been worth it to me. I love you, Victoria. I've loved you for 18 years. That doesn't require you to love me the same way or with the same purity of motivation." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion we'd had in 18 years of marriage. Perhaps the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Richard explained that he'd understood from the beginning that our age gap and his wealth meant I was making practical calculations alongside any emotional connection, that he'd noticed how carefully I paid attention to financial arrangements and estate planning, that he wasn't blind to my preparations for eventual widowhood and the inheritance that would come with it. But he said none of that diminished what we had together, that he valued our partnership even understanding its transactional elements, that he'd rather have a marriage with someone he loved, who was also motivated by security, than be alone, or in a relationship with someone who pretended complete disinterest in practical matters. "I'm going to die before you," Richard said with the same matter-of-fact tone, stating reality without drama or self-pity. "The age gap and my health issues make that essentially certain barring some completely unexpected accident on your part. And when I do die, whether that's next year or in 20 years, you'll inherit substantial wealth that will support you comfortably for the rest of your life. I've arranged my estate that way deliberately, because I want you to be secure, because I want to know you'll be taken care of even after I'm gone. That's not exploitation on your part. That's me choosing to provide for someone I love, knowing that our motivations for being together are mixed but still valuable." I found myself crying, though I couldn't fully articulate why. Partly shame at having my calculations exposed so clearly, at having the performance I'd maintained for 18 years revealed as transparent to someone I'd thought I was fooling. Partly relief at not having to maintain pretenses anymore, at being seen clearly and apparently still accepted. Partly confusion about what this honest acknowledgement meant for our marriage going forward, whether we could continue now that the transactional nature was openly discussed rather than politely ignored. And partly something else, gratitude maybe, or respect, for Richard's willingness to love me despite understanding exactly what I was, for his generosity in providing for me even knowing my motivations were significantly mercenary. "I do care about you," I said when I could speak, needing him to know that even if my motivations were mixed, they weren't purely transactional, that our 18 years together hadn't been complete lie on my part. "It's not just about the money, Richard. You've been good to me, better than I probably deserve. You're intelligent and kind, and you've given me a comfortable life I could never have achieved on my own. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of pure love you seem to feel for me. I don't know if I've ever loved anyone that way or if I'm capable of it." Richard reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle and familiar. "I don't need pure love," he said quietly. "I need honesty about what we have, and commitment to maintaining it as long as it works for both of us. You've been a good wife in the ways that matter. You're loyal. You're present. You make our life together pleasant and comfortable. That you're also planning practically for your financial future doesn't negate the value of what you provide to me and to our marriage. I just don't want you to spend the rest of our marriage pretending you're someone you're not, performing devotion you don't fully feel. I'd rather have honest affection mixed with self-interest than performed love that isn't authentic." The conversation Richard and I had that evening fundamentally altered our marriage, not by ending it or creating crisis, but by stripping away the pretenses that had characterized our relationship for 18 years, and replacing them with uncomfortable but liberating honesty. We talked for hours that night, sitting in our living room as darkness fell outside, and the conversation ranged over territory we'd never explicitly discussed before. My working-class background and the financial anxiety it had created in me, Richard's awareness from the beginning that wealth was a significant factor in my attraction to him, the calculations I'd been making about inheritance and widowhood, his decision to love me despite understanding those calculations, what we each actually wanted from our marriage going forward. Richard was remarkably calm and non-judgmental throughout this conversation, treating my admissions of mercenary motivation with the same matter-of-fact acceptance he'd shown when first revealing he'd always known. When I confessed that I'd been mentally calculating about his death, about optimal timing for widowhood and inheritance, about how I'd live after he was gone, he didn't react with hurt or anger, but with understanding that was almost harder to accept than condemnation would have been. "Of course you think about those things," he said. "You'd be foolish not to. I'm 17 years older than you. I have health issues. You'll almost certainly be my widow at some point. Planning for that reality is just practical, not malicious." I tried to explain that my calculations had gone beyond practical planning into something darker, that I'd sometimes caught myself feeling impatient about timeline, that during his surgery I'd had moments of disappointment when he survived because I'd been preparing emotionally for inheritance and independence. These confessions felt like revealing the worst parts of myself, exposing a coldness and selfishness I'd been ashamed of for years. But Richard listened without visible judgment, nodding as if my admissions were understandable rather than shocking, as if the mercenary thoughts I was confessing were normal human responses to our age gap and his mortality, rather than evidence of terrible character. "I'm not angry about those feelings," Richard said when I finished my halting confession. "I'm actually glad you're being honest about them, rather than continuing to hide them. Yes, it's uncomfortable to know that my wife has sometimes wished I'd die so she could inherit my money. But it's also understandable given the age gap and the financial arrangement we've had. You've spent 18 years financially dependent on me, watching me age while you're still relatively young, knowing that my death will make you independently wealthy. Having complicated feelings about that situation doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human." His acceptance of my worst confessions was disorienting, made it harder rather than easier to maintain my self-concept as calculating opportunist who'd fooled a naive older man into supporting her. Richard clearly wasn't naive, wasn't fooled, hadn't been deceived about my motivations or character. He'd chosen this arrangement with full awareness of what it involved, had decided that having me as wife despite my mixed motivations was preferable to the alternatives available to him. That recognition, that Richard had made his own calculating choice to accept a transactional marriage because it served his needs, complicated my understanding of our power dynamic and who was actually using whom. "Why did you marry me if you knew I was partly motivated by your money?" I asked. genuinely confused about his reasoning. Why stay married to someone you know is preparing for your death and planning to enjoy your inheritance? Why not find someone who actually loved you purely, who wanted you for yourself rather than for financial security? These questions felt important, got at something fundamental about Richard's own motivations and calculations that I'd never previously considered. Richard was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. Because pure love is rare and perhaps overrated, he finally said. Because most relationships have transactional elements even when people pretend they don't. Because I loved you and wanted to be with you regardless of whether your feelings matched mine in intensity or purity. Because having a beautiful, intelligent wife who made my life pleasant and comfortable was valuable to me even if I knew she was also motivated by security. Because I'd rather have the partial affection you were capable of giving than be alone or married to someone who loved me purely, but who I didn't love in return. He paused, then continued. You need to understand, Victoria, that I made my own calculations about our marriage. I was 42 when we met, divorced, with adult children who had their own lives. I could have remained single, dated casually, avoided the complications of marriage. Or I could have pursued women my own age with similar backgrounds who might have loved me more purely, but who I wasn't particularly attracted to or interested in. You were young and beautiful and intelligent. You made me feel less old and settled. You brought energy and perspective into my life that I'd been missing. Yes, I knew you were attracted to my money and security as much as to me personally, but what you gave me in return, the pleasure of your company, the social partnership, the ego boost of having an attractive younger wife, was worth the arrangement from my perspective. This revelation that Richard had made his own calculating choice, had weighed the transactional elements and decided they served his interests, fundamentally shifted how I understood our marriage. I'd been thinking of myself as the opportunist exploiting Richard's naive affection, viewing him as victim of my mercenary manipulation, but he'd never been victim. He'd been willing participant making his own strategic choices about what kind of relationship he wanted and what he was willing to accept to have it. We'd both been calculating, both making decisions based partly on practical benefits rather than pure emotion, both maintaining a marriage that served our respective interests, even if those interests weren't perfectly aligned. So we've both been using each other, I said slowly, testing this new understanding. I've been using you for financial security and lifestyle, and you've been using me for companionship and the ego satisfaction of having younger, attractive wife. Neither of us has been victim. We've both been willing participants in a mutually beneficial arrangement. It sounded cold and cynical when stated so explicitly, but it also felt more honest than the narratives we'd each been maintaining. Me as calculating villain exploiting naive older man. Him as loving husband betrayed by mercenary wife. I wouldn't frame it as using each other exactly, Richard responded, though he didn't seem offended by the characterization. I prefer to think of it as two people making honest choices about what they wanted from marriage and finding an arrangement that worked for both of them, even if it didn't match the romantic ideal. We've had a good marriage, Victoria. Maybe not the fairy tale love story people imagine marriage should be, but a real partnership that has provided both of us with things we valued. I got companionship and partnership with someone I found attractive and interesting. You got financial security and comfortable lifestyle. Both of us got something we wanted enough to maintain the arrangement for 18 years. The conversation eventually wound down as the evening grew late, both of us exhausted from hours of unprecedentedly honest discussion. We went to bed that night without having resolved anything definitively, hadn't decided whether to continue our marriage now that its transactional nature was openly acknowledged, hadn't established new framework for how to relate to each other without the pretenses we'd maintained for years, hadn't determined whether honest recognition of our mutual calculations would strengthen or destroy the partnership we'd built. But something fundamental had shifted. Some weight of performance and pretense had been lifted, creating space for whatever might develop in its absence. Over the following weeks and months, I found myself thinking obsessively about Richard's revelations and what they meant for how I understood myself and our marriage. I'd spent 18 years viewing myself as calculating opportunist, successfully deceiving naive older man into supporting me while I prepared for profitable widowhood. That self-concept had been uncomfortable, had made me feel guilty and ashamed, but it had also been coherent and complete. I knew who I was, understood my motivations, accepted my mercenary nature even while disliking it. But Richard's calm acknowledgement that he'd always known, had chosen our arrangement deliberately with full awareness of my mixed motivations, had made his own calculations about whether having me as wife was worth accepting my transactional approach. That complicated everything. I couldn't view myself as villain if Richard had never been victim. I couldn't maintain my self-concept as cold manipulator if Richard had been equally calculating about what he wanted from marriage and what he was willing to accept to get it. The narrative I'd been telling myself about our marriage and my role in it no longer fit the reality Richard had revealed. I also found myself questioning whether I actually wanted to continue being the person Richard was accepting, someone whose primary lens for viewing marriage was financial security, whose calculations about inheritance and widowhood overshadowed emotional connection, whose relationship with her husband was characterized more by strategic positioning than genuine affection. Richard's acceptance of that version of me had been generous and surprising, but it had also held up a mirror that made me see more clearly what I'd become over 18 years of calculated choices. And looking at that reflection, I wasn't sure I liked what I saw or wanted to continue being that person. The question that tormented me was whether I was capable of being someone different, whether after 18 years of prioritizing financial security and performing affection while making mercenary calculations, I could actually develop genuine feelings for Richard that went beyond appreciation for the comfortable life he provided. Was I capable of loving him, really loving him, in ways that weren't primarily about what he could give me? Or was I fundamentally the opportunist I'd been for 18 years, incapable of emotional connection that wasn't rooted in practical benefit? I started testing this question through small experiments in our daily life, pushing myself to engage with Richard in ways that weren't strategic or calculated, that didn't serve any obvious purpose in terms of maintaining his affection or protecting my financial position. I initiated conversations about topics I was genuinely interested in discussing rather than topics I thought he'd enjoy. I expressed preferences and opinions honestly, even when they differed from his, rather than automatically deferring to his judgment. I allowed myself to be vulnerable and admit uncertainty or mistakes, rather than maintaining the composed, competent performance I'd cultivated for years. Richard noticed these changes and responded positively, seemed almost relieved that I was being more authentic even when authenticity involved disagreement or vulnerability. Our conversations became more engaging and substantive, less like polite exchanges between cordial strangers, and more like genuine dialogue between people who had distinct perspectives they were willing to share. I found myself actually enjoying these interactions in ways I hadn't enjoyed our conversations in years, discovering that genuine engagement was more satisfying than performed agreeableness, even when it involved conflict or exposure of my own ignorance or uncertainty. I also started paying more attention to Richard as person rather than as provider, noticing things about him I'd overlooked during years of viewing him primarily through financial lens. He was funny in dry, understated ways I'd been missing, his humor evident in small observations and ironic commentary rather than obvious jokes. He was thoughtful and considerate in his treatment of service workers and strangers, showing kindness and respect that revealed character I'd been taking for granted. He was genuinely interested in learning and growth, reading extensively and taking courses in subjects he found interesting, maintaining intellectual curiosity and openness that belied his age. These observations made me realize I'd been living with Richard for 18 years without really knowing him, without attending to who he actually was beyond his function as wealthy husband providing comfortable life. I'd been so focused on calculations about inheritance and financial security that I'd failed to see the actual person I was married to, failed to appreciate qualities he possessed that had nothing to do with his money. That recognition made me feel guilty and sad. Guilty for how I'd reduced Richard to his wallet. Sad for the connection I might have missed by viewing our marriage primarily as financial transaction. As I started engaging more authentically with Richard and paying more attention to him as person, I found myself developing feelings that surprised me with their depth and genuineness. I enjoyed his company not just as comfortable routine, but as actual pleasure in being with him specifically. I felt genuine affection when he did thoughtful things, real appreciation for his kindness and intelligence. I experienced actual anxiety when he had medical appointments, worry about his health that went beyond concerns about my financial future. These feelings weren't pure or uncomplicated. I was still conscious of the financial benefits our marriage provided, still aware that his death would make me wealthy widow. But they were real in ways my performed affection had never been, authentic feelings that existed alongside rather than being displaced by my mercenary calculations. Richard noticed this shift too, commented that I seemed more present and emotionally engaged, more genuinely connected to our relationship rather than going through comfortable motions. "You seem different lately," he said one evening about 6 months after our honest conversation. "More real, I guess. Like you're actually here with me rather than performing the role of wife while thinking about other things." The observation was accurate, but also made me self-conscious, wondering if my attempts at genuine connection were themselves a kind of performance, strategic adjustment to maintain the marriage now that my previous calculations had been exposed. But it didn't feel like performance, not in the same way my previous behavior had. I was making conscious choices to engage differently with Richard and our marriage, but the feelings underlying those choices seemed authentic rather than manufactured, genuine responses to actually paying attention to who he was rather than strategic moves designed to protect my position. I told Richard this, explained that his acceptance of my calculating nature had somehow freed me to explore whether I was capable of something more genuine, that knowing he loved me despite understanding my mercenary side had made it possible to consider whether I could love him too. "That was always the gamble," Richard admitted. "When I married you knowing your motivations were mixed, when I decided to accept the transactional elements of our relationship rather than demanding you pretend otherwise, I was gambling that creating space for honesty might eventually allow something more authentic to develop if you were capable of it. I wasn't certain it would work. You might have just continued calculating about inheritance while taking advantage of my acceptance. But I thought it was worth trying, worth giving you room to become someone different if you wanted to, rather than forcing you to maintain pretenses that prevented any genuine feeling from developing." This revelation that Richard had been strategically managing our marriage all along, that his acceptance of my calculating nature had been deliberate choice designed to create conditions for my potential transformation rather than just passive tolerance of my opportunism, was simultaneously flattering and disorienting. Had I changed because I genuinely developed capacity for authentic feeling, or because Richard had manipulated me into changing through strategic acceptance? Was my transformation real? Or was I just responding to his psychological management in ways he'd anticipated and planned for? The questions made my head hurt, suggested layers of calculation and counter-calculation that were dizzying to contemplate. But regardless of Richard's strategic intentions, the feelings I was experiencing felt real to me, felt like genuine affection rather than continued performance. I was enjoying our marriage more than I had in years, finding satisfaction in our daily interactions, feeling connected to Richard in ways that went beyond financial dependency. The shift wasn't complete or pure. I still thought about inheritance sometimes, still maintained awareness of the financial benefits our marriage provided, still had moments of calculating about timeline and optimal outcomes, but those calculations no longer dominated my experience of our relationship, no longer defined how I thought about Richard or evaluated whether to stay married to him. I also started rebuilding other aspects of my identity and life beyond just being Richard's wife, partly because I recognized how limiting that sole identity had become, partly because I wanted to develop capacity and purpose that existed independent of my marital status. I enrolled in graduate program in nonprofit management at the local university, studying part-time while maintaining my household and social responsibilities. Richard supported this decision enthusiastically, paid my tuition without complaint, encouraged my academic pursuits, seemed genuinely pleased I was developing interests and credentials beyond our marriage. The return to education was both challenging and energizing. I'd been out of academic environments for nearly 2 decades, since completing my undergraduate degree at age 22. The intellectual demands of graduate coursework pushed me in ways I hadn't been pushed in years, required me to think critically and write analytically, exposed me to new ideas and frameworks for understanding social issues and organizational dynamics. I discovered I was actually quite good at this kind of work, that I had aptitude for strategic planning and program evaluation, that I could contribute valuable perspectives in class discussions, drawing on my years of volunteer work and social observations. More importantly, succeeding in graduate school gave me sense of competence and accomplishment that came from my own efforts, rather than from being Richard's wife or managing household efficiently. My identity expanded beyond just spouse-providing domestic partnership, encompassed student and future professional with skills and credentials I'd earned independently. That expansion felt psychologically important, created space for self-worth that wasn't entirely dependent on Richard's continued presence and affection, built foundation for potential future that could exist even if our marriage ended through his death or other circumstances. Richard seemed to understand and appreciate this identity expansion, actively encouraged it, even though it meant I was less focused solely on him and our household. "I want you to have a life and purpose beyond just being my wife," he said when I worried aloud that my graduate studies were taking time away from my responsibilities to him. "You're going to outlive me by potentially decades. I'd rather know you'll have career and purpose after I'm gone than have you completely focused on me now, but left directionless when I die. Build something for yourself, Victoria. I want that for you." His generosity about my growing independence was touching and also strategically smart. By encouraging me to develop career skills and credentials, Richard was ensuring I'd be not just financially secure after his death, but also purposefully engaged with meaningful work rather than being wealthy widow with nothing to occupy my time and energy. He was, even in encouraging my independence, thinking ahead to my widowhood and making sure I'd be positioned well for that inevitable transition. The continued strategic thinking, even within generosity, was very characteristic of Richard, sophisticated and multi-layered in ways I'd often underestimated. As I moved through graduate school and continued developing more authentic connection with Richard, our marriage transformed into something neither of us had quite anticipated when we first married 18 years earlier. What had started as significantly transactional relationship, me seeking security, him wanting attractive younger wife, evolved into genuine partnership where both of us felt valued and engaged, beyond just the original practical benefits that had drawn us together. We still benefited from those practical arrangements. I still enjoyed the comfortable lifestyle Richard's wealth provided. He still appreciated having companionable wife who facilitated his social life and provided partnership. But those transactional elements no longer defined our relationship or constituted its primary substance. We started taking trips together that weren't just comfortable tourist experiences, but actual adventures requiring flexibility and shared problem-solving, backpacking in national parks and navigating foreign cities where neither of us spoke the language well, creating shared memories that had emotional resonance beyond just pleasant vacation photos. We had deeper conversations about topics that mattered to both of us: politics and ethics, family relationships and personal history, hopes and fears and dreams, building understanding of each other's inner lives that we'd never developed during years of more superficial, cordial coexistence. We also started confronting conflicts directly, rather than me automatically deferring to Richard's preferences to maintain harmony. When we disagreed about something, where to spend holidays, how to handle situation with his adult sons, what charities to support, we actually negotiated and compromised rather than me yielding to avoid potential friction that might jeopardize my financial position. These negotiations were sometimes difficult and uncomfortable, requiring both of us to articulate preferences and reasoning and listen to perspectives that differed from our own. But they also felt more real and respectful than the conflict avoidance I'd practiced for years, genuine engagement with disagreement, rather than strategic accommodation. Richard seemed to genuinely appreciate these changes in our marriage dynamic, repeatedly commented that he felt like he was finally getting to know who I actually was, rather than the performed version I'd been presenting for years. "I like you better this way," he said one evening after we'd had particularly vigorous discussion about political issue where we disagreed substantially. "I like knowing what you actually think and believe, rather than just hearing agreement with whatever I say. It makes me feel like I'm married to real person, rather than to agreeable accessory." The observation made me realize how much I'd diminished myself through years of strategic accommodation, how much I'd suppressed authentic thoughts and feelings to maintain performance that I'd believed was necessary to protect my financial position. Richard hadn't wanted that performance, hadn't needed me to constantly agree with him or defer to his preferences, had actually been missing authentic engagement he would have welcomed if I'd been willing to risk occasional conflict. My calculating approach to marriage had prevented exactly the kind of genuine partnership Richard had apparently wanted all along, had created distance between us that neither of us had actually preferred, but that I'd believed was necessary price of financial security. The transformation in our marriage over the 2 years following Richard's honest revelation about knowing my mercenary motivations was profound, but also gradual, characterized not by dramatic moments of change, but by steady accumulation of small shifts in how we related to each other and how I understood myself. I completed my graduate degree in nonprofit management, graduated with honors and strong recommendations from professors who encouraged me to pursue leadership positions in the field. Richard attended my graduation ceremony, visibly proud and genuinely enthusiastic about my accomplishment in ways that made me feel valued for my own achievements rather than just for being his wife. I started working part-time at a nonprofit organization focused on financial literacy and education for low-income families, using my graduate training and my own experience navigating class differences to help others develop skills and knowledge that could improve their economic circumstances. The work was meaningful in ways my previous volunteer activities had never been, gave me sense of purpose and contribution that existed completely independent of my identity as Richard's wife. The income was modest, only about $40,000 a year for the 25 hours per week I worked, but it was mine, earned through my own skills and effort, first money I'd generated independently in over 15 years. Having my own income, however modest compared to Richard's substantial wealth, changed something psychological for me about our marriage and my sense of autonomy within it. I was no longer completely financially dependent on Richard, no longer entirely vulnerable to his continued goodwill in life. If our marriage ended for any reason, if Richard changed his mind about estate planning or if we divorced, I now had at least minimal ability to support myself rather than being completely destitute. That small financial independence, insignificant in practical terms given the comfortable lifestyle Richard's money provided, was psychologically enormous in terms of how I felt about my own agency and choices. Richard noticed this shift and commented on it, said I seemed more confident and self-assured, more comfortable asserting my own preferences and perspective. Having your own work and income is good for you, he observed. You seem less anxious, less concerned about my reactions to things. Like you know you'd be okay even without me, so you can be more honest about what you actually think and want. His observation was accurate. The small financial independence I'd established had reduced my anxiety about preserving Richard's affection at all costs, had made it possible to risk occasional conflict or disagreement because I was no longer entirely dependent on his continued support and approval. But even as I developed more independence and authenticity in our marriage, I remained conscious of the continued financial inequality between us and the reality that Richard's death would still make me a very wealthy widow. My small nonprofit salary didn't change the fundamental economic structure of our relationship. We still lived primarily on Richard's income and accumulated wealth. I still benefited enormously from the lifestyle his money provided. I would still inherit millions when he eventually died. The transformation in our marriage hadn't eliminated the transactional elements or made my future inheritance irrelevant. It had just changed how those realities related to my feelings and choices. Richard's health continued to decline gradually as he moved through his late 50s into his early 60s. Nothing catastrophic, just the steady accumulation of age-related issues. His blood pressure required more medication to control. His arthritis became more limiting and sometimes painful. He developed type 2 diabetes that required dietary modifications and regular monitoring. Each new health issue was a reminder of our age gap and his mortality, but my emotional response to these developments had shifted significantly from my earlier calculating assessments of timeline and inheritance implications. Now, when Richard had health issues or medical appointments, I felt genuine concern and worry that went beyond anxiety about my financial future. The thought of losing him produced real sadness and grief, emotions I hadn't fully experienced during our earlier years when I'd been primarily preparing for widowhood as financial opportunity. I'd developed authentic affection for Richard as person, not just appreciation for what he provided. And that meant his potential death felt like loss of someone I'd miss emotionally rather than just logistical transition to next phase of my financial security. This shift in my feelings didn't mean I stopped thinking about inheritance or stopped being aware of the financial benefits Richard's death would eventually bring me. I still knew exactly what I stood to inherit. The numbers hadn't changed significantly, still approximately $16 to $18 million depending on market conditions and business performance. I still sometimes thought about my life as wealthy widow, imagined how I'd structure my time and activities once I was financially independent and no longer in daily partnership with Richard. Those calculations and imaginings hadn't disappeared. They'd just become background awareness rather than foreground obsession, one element of my consciousness, rather than the dominant lens through which I viewed our marriage. About a year ago, when I was 42 and Richard was 59, we had another honest conversation that further illuminated the complex dynamics of our marriage and how we'd each been navigating them. We'd been traveling in Italy, visiting museums and historical sites, enjoying the kind of culturally enriching vacation that had become more frequent as my interests expanded beyond just comfortable resort experiences. One evening in Florence, sitting at an outdoor cafe drinking wine and watching people pass by, Richard said something that surprised me with its directness. "I know you've changed over the past few years, that you've developed more genuine feelings for me than you had initially, but I'm curious whether you still think about my death and the inheritance, whether those calculations are still part of how you think about our marriage." The question was characteristically honest and direct, typical of how our conversations had evolved since his initial revelation that he'd always known about my mercenary motivations. I considered how to answer, wanting to be truthful, but also not wanting to hurt him by revealing I still sometimes thought about his death in financial terms, even as I developed genuine affection for him. "I still think about it," I admitted slowly. "The calculations haven't completely disappeared. I'm aware you're older than me, that you have health issues, that I'll probably be your widow eventually. And yes, I'm aware that your death will make me financially independent in ways that my small nonprofit salary never will. Those realities haven't stopped being true just because I've developed more authentic feelings for you." I paused, trying to articulate the complexity of my current emotional state. But the way I think about those realities has changed. It used to be that thinking about your death felt like planning for desirable outcome, like waiting for transition to better phase of my life. Now it feels like acknowledging inevitable loss that I'll grieve even though it will bring financial benefits. I've come to actually love you, Richard. Not purely, not perfectly, but genuinely. And that means your death will hurt in ways I don't think it would have hurt 10 years ago, even though I'll still inherit millions and be comfortable for the rest of my life. Richard listened to this confession with the same thoughtful attention he brought to most of our conversations now, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, sipping his wine and watching the Italian evening unfold around us. "That's honest," he finally said. "And I appreciate the honesty more than I would appreciate performance of complete grief or pretense that you never think about inheritance. The truth is, I think about it too. About dying, about what will happen after I'm gone, about how you'll handle being wealthy widow, and whether you'll be happy or just financially secure." He continued, "I've made choices about my estate planning with the goal of ensuring you'll not just be rich, but also purposeful after I die. The income from the trusts I've established will be substantial, several $100,000 a year probably, but it's structured in ways that encourage you to continue working and contributing rather than just living as idle wealthy person. I want you to have security, but also meaning money, but also purpose. Because I love you enough to want your whole life to be good, not just the parts while I'm alive." This revelation that Richard had been thinking strategically about my post-widowhood life had structured the inheritance not just to make me wealthy, but to encourage me toward purpose and engagement, was touching and also consistent with the sophisticated thinking I'd come to appreciate about him. He loved me enough to plan for my well-being beyond his death, to think about what would make my eventual widowhood fulfilling rather than just comfortable. The generosity of that kind of planning, The long-term care it represented made me feel valued in ways that went beyond financial provision. "I don't deserve you," I said, emotion making my voice unsteady. "I spent years viewing you primarily as source of financial security, calculating about your death, preparing for inheritance while performing affection I didn't fully feel. And you knew all of that and loved me anyway, and planned for my future happiness, even though I was being mercenary about our marriage. I don't understand how you could be so generous to someone who was being so calculating." Richard reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm and familiar. "You deserved love even when you weren't capable of fully returning it," he said simply. "People don't have to earn love by being perfect or by having pure motivations. I saw who you were. Someone shaped by childhood financial insecurity, someone trying to build security through means available to you, someone capable of growth if given space and acceptance. And I chose to love that person, hoping you might eventually become someone capable of loving me back, which apparently you have." The conversation in Florence was a watershed moment, clarified for both of us that our marriage had evolved into something neither of us had quite expected. Genuine partnership built on unusual foundation of acknowledged transactional elements, authentic affection that coexisted with continued awareness of practical benefits, love that was real even though it wasn't pure or uncomplicated by ongoing calculations about inheritance and death. We'd both made our peace with the complexity, accepted that our marriage contained layers of genuine feeling and strategic calculation that most couples might prefer to deny, but that we were able to acknowledge and discuss openly. In the year since that conversation, as I've moved into my early 40s and Richard has entered his 60s, our marriage has continued to deepen and evolve. We've become genuinely close in ways I never anticipated when I married him 18 years ago, primarily for financial security. I enjoy his company, value his perspective, appreciate his intelligence and kindness, feel grateful for the partnership we've built. The financial benefits he provides remain real and significant. I still live in a beautiful home, still have access to resources and experiences most people never get, still know I'll inherit substantial wealth when he dies. But those benefits no longer dominate how I think about Richard or our marriage, no longer constitute the primary reason I choose to stay with him. I've also continued to grow in ways that exist independent of our marriage. My work at the nonprofit has expanded to full-time position with more responsibility and a salary that's now $60,000 a year, still modest but enough to support myself basically if necessary. I've developed friendships and professional networks that are mine rather than extensions of Richard's social circle. I've built life and identity that has substance and meaning beyond just being wealthy man's wife, creating foundation that will sustain me when Richard eventually dies and I transition to widowhood. Richard's health has stabilized somewhat with good medical management and lifestyle modifications, his doctors now suggesting he could potentially live into his 70s or even beyond if he maintains current regimen. That possibility, potentially another 10 or 15 years of marriage rather than imminent widowhood, no longer feels like unfortunate postponement of inheritance, but like gift of additional time with someone I've come to genuinely love. The shift in my emotional response to Richard's potential longevity reveals how completely my internal landscape has changed from the calculating opportunist who married him primarily for security. But I want to be clear that this transformation hasn't made me into a completely different person who no longer thinks about money or security or inheritance. I'm still shaped by my working-class background and the financial anxiety it created, still value security and stability in ways that reflect childhood experiences of scarcity and stress. I'm still conscious of the substantial wealth I'll inherit when Richard dies, still aware that widowhood will make me financially independent in ways that fundamentally change my life circumstances and choices. Those realities and that awareness haven't disappeared just because I've developed genuine affection for Richard. What's changed is that the mercenary calculations no longer define me or dictate my choices, or prevent me from experiencing authentic connection. I can love Richard genuinely, while also being aware that his death will make me wealthy widow. I can value our marriage for emotional partnership while also appreciating the financial security it provides. I can be calculating about some aspects of my future while being emotionally present in my current relationship. The complexity and mixed motivations that characterize my experience don't negate the authenticity of what I feel for Richard. They're just honest acknowledgement that human emotions and relationships are rarely pure or simple. I think often about Richard's initial revelation that he'd always known about my mercenary motivations and had chosen to love me anyway, creating space for me to potentially become someone capable of genuine feeling if I was able to. His strategic acceptance of my calculating nature ended up being more transformative than any demand for me to change or any condemnation of my opportunism would have been. By loving me as I was rather than requiring me to be different, Richard paradoxically made it possible for me to actually become different, to develop capacity for authentic connection that probably wouldn't have emerged under pressure or demand. That recognition has implications beyond just my relationship with Richard, speaks to something larger about how change and growth happen in humans. We don't usually become better people because someone demands or requires improvement. We become better when we're accepted as we are, and given space to choose whether we want to be different. Richard's acceptance of my mercenary calculations created psychological space for me to examine whether I wanted to continue being primarily motivated by financial security, or whether I was capable of something more authentic and connected. The choice to grow came from within rather than being imposed from outside, making it more genuine and sustainable than performed transformation would have been. Now, at 43 and nearly 19 years into marriage that began as primarily transactional arrangement on my part, I find myself in unexpected position of genuinely loving husband I initially married mostly for money, while simultaneously remaining aware that his eventual death will make me wealthy, independent woman. The contradiction doesn't trouble me the way it once did. I've accepted that I'm a complex person with mixed motivations, that I can be both calculating and authentically loving, that my feelings for Richard don't have to be pure to be real. Richard and I recently updated his estate planning, making some adjustments to account for changed tax laws and to establish additional charitable giving structures. Going through that process, being reminded of the substantial wealth I'll inherit, I noticed my emotional response was different from my reactions to similar planning sessions earlier in our marriage. Now I felt sadness at the reminder that Richard will eventually die and leave me alone. Grief at the inevitable loss that will come, even though I'll be financially secure afterward. The financial aspects of the planning still mattered. I still wanted to understand the structures and ensure my interests were protected. But they weren't the primary emotional content the way they used to be. Richard noticed my tears during one planning session and asked if I was okay. "I'm just thinking about losing you," I said honestly. "I know I'll be financially secure. I know you've arranged everything so I'll be comfortable for the rest of my life. But I'll miss you anyway." The money doesn't make that reality easier. Richard looked at me with expression I couldn't quite read. Satisfaction maybe, or validation, or just tender sadness at the mortality we were planning for. "That's all I ever wanted," he said softly. "For you to value me as person, not just as provider. For my death to matter to you beyond just financial transition." I want to end this story by acknowledging its uncomfortable honesty about motivations and calculations most people prefer to deny or minimize in relationships. The truth is that many marriages, perhaps most, contain transactional elements that polite society pretends don't exist. People marry for security, for status, for practical benefits alongside or sometimes instead of romantic love. They make calculations about earning potential and inheritance and lifestyle, about what they're getting from relationship and whether it's worth what they're giving. These considerations are normal human behavior, strategic assessment of important life choices that have long-term implications for well-being and security. The difference between me and many others isn't necessarily that I was more calculating in my approach to marriage. It's that I'm being more honest about the calculations I made and how they shaped my behavior and choices over nearly 2 decades. Most people hide these calculations from themselves and others, maintain pretenses about pure love and romance that obscure the practical considerations influencing their relationship decisions. I spent years maintaining such pretenses myself, performing love while calculating about inheritance, pretending motivations that were much simpler and purer than my actual complex mix of genuine affection and strategic positioning. But I don't want this story to be read as endorsement of purely transactional marriages or as suggestion that mercenary opportunism is admirable or desirable approach to relationships. The calculating approach I took to my marriage with Richard caused harm, not to him, since he understood and accepted what I was doing, but to myself. The years I spent primarily viewing our relationship through financial lens, preparing emotionally for his death and my inheritance, calculating about optimal timelines and outcomes. Those were years when I missed opportunities for genuine connection and authentic experience of partnership that would have been more satisfying than strategic positioning. Richard's acceptance of my calculating nature created conditions for transformation I might not have achieved otherwise, but the transformation itself required me to recognize that the mercenary approach I'd been taking was making me unhappy, even as it provided security. Constantly performing affection while hiding calculations, maintaining strategic positioning while pretending spontaneous devotion, preparing for widowhood while pretending to hope for long marriage, the psychological burden of this deception and double consciousness was exhausting and ultimately unsatisfying. Genuine connection, even with all its vulnerability and messiness and lack of strategic control, has proven more rewarding than calculated performance ever was. I also want to acknowledge Richard's role in how our marriage evolved, his sophisticated strategic thinking that matched my own calculations in many ways. He wasn't naive victim of my opportunism. He was willing participant, making his own choices about what kind of relationship he wanted and what he was willing to accept to have it. His decision to accept my mercenary motivations rather than demanding I hide them or change immediately was itself strategic. Gamble that acceptance might create space for authentic feeling to develop if I was capable of it. We were both calculating, both strategic, both making decisions based on mix of practical considerations and emotional desires. The question of who was using whom in our marriage doesn't have simple answer. I was using Richard's wealth for security and comfortable lifestyle. Richard was using my youth and attractiveness for ego satisfaction and social partnership. Both of us benefited from arrangement we'd entered. Both of us got things we wanted from relationship, even if those things weren't purely romantic or emotionally profound. The mutual use, if we want to call it that, was negotiated implicitly and eventually explicitly, accepted by both parties as reasonable exchange, given what each of us was offering and seeking. But beyond the transactional elements and strategic calculations, we also developed genuine affection and authentic partnership that transcended the practical benefits motivating us initially. That emotional evolution wasn't inevitable. I might have remained primarily mercenary throughout our marriage. Richard might have continued loving someone incapable of fully loving him back. But his acceptance created space for growth, and I chose to grow into that space, developing capacity for genuine feeling I hadn't fully possessed when we married. Now I can say honestly that I love Richard, not perfectly or purely but genuinely, in ways that will make his eventual death painful, even though it will also make me wealthy widow. I value our partnership for emotional connection, as well as for practical benefits. I choose to stay married to him not just because leaving would mean giving up financial security, but because I actually enjoy being married to him, appreciate who he is, feel grateful for relationship we've built together over nearly 2 decades. The inheritance will still be substantial, approximately $18 million now with recent market appreciation, wealth that will support me comfortably for rest of my life and allow me to contribute meaningfully to causes I care about. When Richard dies, whether that's next year or in 20 years, I'll grieve genuinely while also inheriting wealth that transforms my circumstances. Those realities will coexist: grief and financial benefit, loss and gain, sadness and security. The complexity doesn't negate either truth, just acknowledges that human experience rarely fits neat narratives about pure emotions uncomplicated by practical considerations. My name is Victoria Ashford. I'm 43 years old and married for nearly 19 years to a man who loves me deeply and whom I've come to genuinely love in return, though that love developed gradually over years and emerged from foundation of initially mercenary motivations. I married Richard primarily for his money and the security his wealth provided, spent years calculating about inheritance and preparing for profitable widowhood, maintained performance of devoted wife while privately planning for his death. But his acceptance of my calculating nature created space for transformation, and I chose to grow into someone capable of authentic connection alongside continued awareness of practical benefits. I still love the money Richard will leave me when he dies, still value the security and independence that inheritance will provide, still think sometimes about my life as wealthy widow. But I also love Richard himself now, genuinely and authentically, in ways that will make his loss painful despite the financial benefits his death will bring me. The complexity of simultaneously loving someone and looking forward to inheriting their wealth isn't comfortable to acknowledge, doesn't fit romantic narratives about pure love uncontaminated by practical considerations. But it's honest about how humans actually navigate relationships, about the mix of emotion and calculation that characterizes many marriages, even when people prefer to deny those elements. Richard understood this complexity from the beginning, accepted it as reality of our relationship, loved me despite and perhaps because of my honest mercenary motivations. His sophisticated understanding and strategic acceptance taught me that authenticity and calculation can coexist, that acknowledging transactional elements doesn't prevent genuine affection from developing, that being seen clearly and loved anyway is more valuable than being loved for performed version of self. Our marriage, built on unusual foundation of openly acknowledged mercenary motivations and strategic acceptance, has become more authentic and satisfying than marriages built on pretense of pure love often manage to be. This is my story. Uncomfortable, honest, complicated by calculations and strategies most people prefer to deny, but that shape many relationships more than we like to admit. I'm not proud of the years I spent primarily as calculating opportunist viewing my husband as profitable investment, but I'm also not ashamed of acknowledging those calculations honestly, rather than hiding them behind performance of pure devotion. And I'm grateful for Richard's acceptance that created space for me to become someone capable of genuine love alongside continued practical awareness, someone who can value both emotional connection and financial security without having to pretend either consideration doesn't exist.